Hi everyone, I'm making an informational video today. Don't ask questions, I just felt like doing this. We're starting now. Let's begin with ink mines. The basic function of these bombs is that you can place them directly where you are standing, and they will stay there until somebody walks over them. Then they explode and deal damage to whoever was caught in the blast. Their function in Splatoon 1 is that they're a nightmare. They deal 180 damage on direct hit, are completely invisible to enemies, and have a much larger blast radius than the iterations in Splatoon 2 and 3. You can only place one at a time and they explode after a certain amount of time has passed, but still, this is nuts. Of course, these things are basically made for tower control and make the Luna Blaster the unrivaled meta weapon of Splat 1 Tower. An interesting Splatoon 1-ism about the ink mine, by the way, is that there's an ability called Bomb Sniffer that feels like it was specifically made to counter this thing. It lets you see where ink mines are, as well as decreases the damage you take from splash damage. This ability never came back in later games, along with a slew of other weird Splatoon 1 exclusive abilities. They drastically changed the ink mine in Splatoon 2, and kept it the same for Splatoon 3. They deal 45 damage on direct hit now, and put a point sensor on anyone caught in the blast or splash of the explosion. You can also place 2 at a time now, and they don't explode after a set amount of time anymore. Opponents can also see them now without having to dedicate an entire main ability slot to it. Yeah, ink mines aren't really too great anymore, but it's funny when you get a kill with them. They're just sort of something to put down at a choke point now, and they occasionally do something. They also don't explode through the spire on the tower anymore, so they're not even great for that purpose. Next up is the Splash Wall. The basic function of this is that it creates a wall of ink that protects anyone behind it. It slowly dies out over time. The Splash Wall isn't as different as the ink mine is, but it does have one big difference. In Splatoon 1, if you throw a Splash Wall directly on top of an opponent, or someone walks into it while it's still active, it will insta-kill them. In the famous words of Choco Conroy,
"This thing is a guillotine."
For obvious reasons, this was changed in Splatoon 2 and onward. In later games, it just bumps opponents away and does a bit of damage. Next up is the Disruptor or the Toxic Mist. Its basic function is that it nerfs your opponents if they are caught in the blast. Similar to the ink mine, the Disruptor works completely differently in the first game, so much so that the later iterations of the sub are just called a different name. The Disruptor instantly explodes upon contact with either the ground or a player, and creates a large blast that, instead of dealing damage, will severely cripple your opponent. They can't jump as high, they can't run or swim as fast, their ink consumption is increased, their ink recovery rate is decreased, and they glow in the sights of enemy players. These effects last for about 5 seconds and then wear off. The blast only affects people in its radius when it goes off. Then, in Splatoon 2 and onwards, they just changed the Disruptor so much, they just called it something else. The Toxic Mist. This sub still explodes upon contact with the ground or a player, but instead of the blast immediately disappearing, it lingers and only applies its effects to anyone currently in the bubble. The effects of the Toxic Mist are now that it just slows down opponents currently caught in its grasp, and depletes their ink tank as long as they're in the mist. It stayed the exact same for Splatoon 3. An interesting and disgusting fact about the Toxic Mist is that, unlike the Disruptor, it is blatantly stated that the mist is the bodily fluids of a certain creature suspended in mist form. In layperson's terms, it's piss. Then, finally, we come to the Seeker / the Curling Bomb / the Auto Bomb. This one's weird. The Seeker is an interesting case, because instead of being a sub-weapon that was changed drastically between games, it was instead split into 2 different sub-weapons. Its function in Splatoon 1 is that it makes a long trail of ink as it moves forward and will home in on opponents, exploding on contact. And on direct hit, hey, guess what? It insta-kills too! Are you starting to sense a pattern with Splatoon 1 sub-weapons that were changed in Splatoon 2 and onward? I know I sure am! I suppose it's balanced out by taking a whopping 80% of your ink tank on use, but this is still just miserable to fight against on a stage like Port Mackerel. Also, an interesting side note about Seekers is that they're available in story mode. I don't know, just thought that was neat. Then, in Splatoon 2, they realized their error and split the 2 main parts of this sub into 2 different subs. These 2 parts are the Curling Bomb and the Auto Bomb. The Curling Bomb, upon deployment, moves forward in a straight line, making long paths of ink for you to swim through. can also hold the R button to cook the curling bomb, shortening its travel distance and time to detonation, but greatly increasing its blast radius and damage. Unlike the Seeker, however, this will not seek opponents. It instead bounces off of walls and explodes after a certain amount of time. Then, the other half of the Seeker got turned into the Auto Bomb. This little goober, when thrown, will create a small circle that seeks out opponents, then will slowly walk up to them and explode once they get close enough. There's a bit of delay on detonation once they reach their target, making them easier to avoid, unlike the Seeker, which just immediately explodes on contact. These little guys are like kinda not as good, but they're cute, so I don't really care. Those are all the really interesting examples I noticed, but there are some other smaller examples of changes between games. In Splatoon 2 and onwards, the sprinkler remains almost the exact same, but now weakens over time. I didn't actually know the sprinklers lasted forever until making this video. Like, I just now learned this. The squid beacon was also changed a little bit in Splat 2 and onwards. It can now be used twice and then gets destroyed. I think the point sensor was also changed, but like, the wiki page just has this word soup that I really don't feel like reading, so I just won't bother. If you want a better explanation of the sub and main weapons of Splatoon, I recommend looking up Chugga Conroy's weapon bios. It's a very interesting resource for learning about this stuff. Okay, I have no clue how to end this video. Just get out of my house, okay?